Silas Whitmore seeks nothing but simplicity. A lifetime is too long to pursue complexity, especially after his heart was broken 15 years ago, when his only wife left, leaving a void colder than a long winter in the Wild West. Since then, he has withdrawn from all contact, living alone in an old log cabin more than 2 days' ride from the nearest town. There, Silas has the peace he believes he needs. No people, no questions, no past. Just the seasons, the cattle, and the wind howling through the window at night. And then one autumn morning, as the chill began to creep into the wood of the house, Silas mounted his horse and rode into town to buy some salt and seeds. It was a simple annual trip, no different from any other. But when he met a strange merchant, slim, shifty-eyed, and was offered a crate of goods at an astonishingly low price, he had no doubts. He thought only that fortune had smiled upon him. Until he returned home, opened the lid of the box, and saw those eyes. There was no cry, no start, no reaction except the gaze, dark, silent, and deep as a bottomless well fixed on him. A baby no more than 4 months old, wrapped in a tattered blanket, thick dark hair as tangled as hay, face red from crying too long. But now it was silent, silent, looking at Silas as if waiting, not for food, not for help, but for recognition. In that moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind blew through the pine trees, carrying a whispering sound from the ghosts in his memory. Inside, Silas could only stand still, his hands still holding the lid of the barrel, his heart pounding like a drum. He had not seen anything that shook his heart like this in 30 years. Not the storm that had torn apart the roof in 1887. Not the grizzly bear stalking the cowshed. But a small creature, nameless, wordless, whose gaze had cracked every defense he had built up over 3 decades. That look demands more than pity. It demands responsibility. And for Silas, responsibility was something he had denied all his life. He had longed for a child, but his wife's death had taken away his last hope. After that, he learned to wrap himself in solitude, in a routine life where no one could interfere. Every time he thought of the child, he told himself, that's over. Not for me. And yet now the child in the box was like a door suddenly opened, exposing all the pain he thought was buried deep in the dry soil of the Wild West. Silas didn't know what to do. Leave it behind. Take it back to town on his horse. Wait for someone to claim it. Or worse, pretend he never saw it. But even though he did not say it out loud, he already had the answer in his heart. Because once the child's eyes met his, he was no longer Silas Whitmore, the old man living alone in the mountains. He had become the only thing the child had in the world. And so a man who had avoided all connection for 3 decades was faced with the inevitable connecting with another life, not through words, not through blood, but through a deep, visceral, beyond reason feeling that sometimes destiny is not found in churches or on the battlefield, but in the very things you never thought would happen. The little cabin still smelled of damp wood, of a closed world, a place Silas Whitmore had thought no one could enter. But that door was now opened not only by the appearance of a child in a cargo box, but also by 3 strangers riding from the direction of the eastern trees in the fading afternoon. They came with the tired, hurried air of those seeking something precious. A tall man with a thick mustache and steely eyes. He said he was the child's uncle. A younger man, his nerves as taut as a bowstring, glancing from side to side. And then there was her, Elena, disheveled hair, sunken eyes, and a voice that trembled as if only her breath were real. She said she was the child's mother. Thomas. My son's name is Thomas, she said, her voice choked, her red eyes fixed on Silas. He, the merchant, tricked us, took my son away. Have you seen him? Silas looked at her. He wasn't sure of anything at the moment. Just a hunch, the quiet intuition of a man who had spent his life watching the wind and the earth and the wild animals and knowing when something wasn't right. He responded with silence. We may be wrong, the mustachioed man interjected, nodding slightly with forced politeness. But if you see any unusual cargo, we would be grateful to have a look. There was something about his words that made the air in the cabin thick. The words were honeyed, but in each pause there was a cold calculation, as if each word had been chosen to cover up something that should not be said. Elena took a step forward. You don't understand, she said, almost pleading. I haven't held my baby in 3 days. I know his cries. Please. Just then, as if to answer for Silas, a cry came from behind the pile of flour sacks. It was loud, real, urgent. Elena jerked her eyes bright but an unnatural bright, like someone about to pounce. Silas had no choice. He stepped to the door blocking the entrance, trying to keep his voice even. It's just a stray cat. It meows whenever they have guests. But he knew he was lying, and so did they. Elena suddenly stepped forward, her hands outstretched as if in supplication. But the child did not wait for her to reach him. It cried out as if its little soul had sensed the danger approaching. When Silas allowed them into the cabin and saw Elena holding the baby Thomas up, the silence was deafening. Her hands fumbled under the limp head. She didn't know how to hold her neck. She didn't know how to support her bottom. There was none of the instinctive movement of someone who had held a child. And it was then, in the evening light slanting through the window, that he saw it. A dark streak of dried blood ran down her sleeve. Elena saw his gaze. She pulled her hand back, turning away as if to hide. But it was too late. No one said anything. But what was left unsaid was the most terrifying silence. Frank, the young man, suddenly spoke up. The child is not well. We should take him before someone else comes. Silas stood in the middle of the small room, his heart pounding, not from old age or fear, but from a growing certainty these men had not come for a reunion. They had come to retrieve lost goods. And the child in their arms, it did not belong to them. Not by blood, not by heart, but by the fear that screamed through every heart-wrenching cry. And so for the first time in years, Silas understood that he was not just holding a child. He was holding a truth, and standing in the middle of it were those who wanted to commodify it. The mustachioed man had his hand on the butt of his gun, not exactly threatening, but enough to make the air in the cabin tighten like a bowstring about to snap. Frank, the younger one, remained silent, but his eyes were darting around, searching for a weak spot, as if every grain of wood, every crevice in the floorboards might be an escape route. Elena held the baby in her hands, shaking her mouth pressed together as if chewing a lie that wouldn't go down. Silas stood there in the middle of the cramped room, his hand on his old gun, the Winchester he had carried since he'd been hunting deer, protecting his cattle from wolves. It had been years since he'd touched it with the intent to kill. It had been years since he'd had to choose between life and what was right. And now the right thing was screaming in the arms of a strange woman, the child constantly struggling as if trying to escape from the person who claimed to be its mother. Silas knew the feeling of being caught between the instinct to survive and the vague call of morality. He had lived with it for 30 years. The first time was when his wife died and he didn't go back to town, didn't go to the doctor, didn't seek comfort. He just left, disappeared from the world. A self-proclaimed loner thinking, no one can hurt me if I'm quiet. And perhaps because of that, he missed a chance to be a father, to go on living instead of just existing. But now it's different. Now there was a being looking up at him as if he were the last thing standing between it and the darkness. We don't want any trouble, Elena said, her voice choking. Just take the boy and go. No one will suffer. Silas's answer was silence. But this time the silence wasn't denial. It was accumulation. Every pain, every year of living as a shadow, every lost opportunity, all of it was now pouring into one decision. His hand gripped the gun, shaking not from fear of the bullet, but from knowing what would happen after the first shot. Because once he fired, he would no longer be an outsider. No longer the old man in the woods that everyone had forgotten. He would be a man who chose to stand on the side of life, and from there would be no turning back. Frank moved. He took a step toward the wooden table where he had placed the bag. In his eyes, Silas saw not fear, but calculation. Cold, opportunistic. Such men loved no one, nor spared no one, not even a child. Silas moved to the right, standing in front of Elena and the baby. Put him down, he said, his voice dry but sharp as a knife. Elena froze. Frank looked at the mustachioed man. The other man was no longer smiling. I don't want to do this, Silas continued. But if you force me, I will. I let it all slip away once. Not again. Elena shook her head, her lips moving as if to say something, but then she looked at the baby in her arms, crying hoarsely, her face pale with exhaustion. And for a brief moment, the defenses in her eyes cracked. Some part of it, a tiny part, was true. Perhaps she had been someone else, a victim, dragged into this quagmire. But now she was on the wrong side and only she could turn back. Silas saw it clearly, but he could not bet the child's life on the awakening of a man who had long since given up on his conscience. He raised his gun and took a half step forward. "Fuck, he'll shoot," Frank yelled. The mustachioed man pulled out his gun. Elena held the baby tighter. And in that split second, Silas understood. The bullet was not as scary as the moment of deciding who he would become. The gunshots tore through the cabin. What happened next, life, death, bloodshed, remains unclear. But one thing was certain from that moment on: Silas Whitmore was no longer a loner hiding in the deep woods. He had become what fate had denied him all his life, a father, if only by choice. The afternoon fell like a silent warning in the west. Darkness stretched across the pines, casting shadows over the small cabin where Silas Whitmore, an old man who had lived alone for 3 decades, waited for the storm to come. But this time it was not wind, but the sound of horses' hooves. 5 horses, 5 men riding through the clearing, moving as one, never missing a beat, never hesitating. Men who had learned to kill. In the middle is Crenshaw. He needed no introduction. One look at the silver of his hair, the long black coat that reached his calves, and the confidence with which he sat. He was a commanding man, not a follower. Hand over the child, his voice cut through the air like a knife. And you can continue living in your lonely hole. Silas didn't answer, he just looked. He still held the Winchester in his hand, standing on the porch of the cabin. Behind him, Elena was holding the baby, Thomas, in the locked bedroom. Beside her was a pistol. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were different, no longer calculating. Just fear and something like realization. Crenshaw raised his hand. 5 gunmen raised their weapons. Silas knew the game. He would not rush in like a gang of amateur criminals. He would set up split stall until he showed an opening. But what Crenshaw did not know was Silas did not intend to play for a draw. He had lived long enough to know that some demons cannot be compromised. They only stop when they are cut off at the root. "Thomas is not yours," said Silas, "and you shall not touch him." Crenshaw laughed. "Then you just chose the most painful way to die." He lowered his hand. Gunfire roared. Glass shattered. The cabin shook. Silas rolled to the wooden floor, dodging the bullet that whizzed past his ear. He fired back without aiming, just enough to keep them hidden. One of the 5 fell in the first volley. Luck maybe. Hunter's instinct. Surely, he crawled toward the back door, blood seeping from a gash in his shoulder, a splinter of wood lodged in it when the glass exploded. But he didn't stop. There was no room for pain. Another man circled around the side of the cabin, hiding behind the gutter. Silas held his breath, waiting for him to step out a half second too soon, then squeezed the trigger. Another explosion. Another body fell. The Winchester had only 4 rounds left. Inside, the baby cried again. The sound cut through the smoke and bullets over the pounding of Silas's heart. Thomas was still alive, still calling, still believing that someone would come. "No one will take you from me again," Silas whispered. Not an oath, but a conviction. The back door swung open. Elena ran out, her face pale. "They're burning straw outside the walls. They're going to burn the whole cabin down." Silas gritted his teeth and took the child. The boy's warmth radiated through the blanket, seeping into his bleeding arm like fire. He turned to Elena. "Take the gun. Guard the front door. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you run south. Find someone, but make sure the boy doesn't fall into anyone's hands." Elena nodded, for once without arguing, without asking. Silas circled around the side of the cabin, dodging between the trees and the smoke. The other 2 were crouching, reloading. One held a torch, the other held a carbine. He fired first. The bullet hit the man in the shoulder, sending him screaming. Crenshaw returned fire. The bullet tore across Silas's cheek, cutting a searing, hot gash. But he did not stop. He charged forward, an axe in his other hand. Crenshaw was caught off guard. He faltered half a step, and that was all Silas needed. The axe blade chopped into his hand, knocking the gun off his hand. He screamed, tripped, and fell to the ground. Silas kicked away his weapon, raising the Winchester one last time. "I let my wife die, and did nothing," he said, his voice hoarse. "This time I will not back down." Pull the trigger. The gunshot ends all sound. The last man, the youngest mercenary, fled into the woods, leaving his comrades, his wages, his honor. He had only one thing left: fear. Silas sank to the ground, his breathing ragged, his shirt bloody, his gun empty. But the baby was still in his arms. alive, intact. For the first time in 30 years, he no longer felt empty. Amid the bodies, the dying fires, and the dried blood, there was an eerie silence. Not loneliness, but peace. He looked up at the sky. The wind had changed direction. After the last shot rang out, everything fell into an unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of death or loneliness, but a kind of peace that had never been felt before. As if the rough, barren land where Silas's cabin had been had finally begun to show a little mini green amid the ashes. Crenshaw lay motionless in the dust, his bloody hands clutching at nothing. The rest, some dead, some fleeing. The human trafficking ring he had run with blood and money, fear and promise, had collapsed in the most unlikely of places, a decaying cabin in the woods run by an old recluse and an unwanted child. Elena walked out, Thomas still in her arms, fast asleep from exhaustion, his rosy cheeks rising and falling with each breath. Her eyes, once filled with calculation, now held something else. Not fear, but guilt, then hope. "What now?" she asked, her voice as soft as the dew. Silas did not answer immediately. He looked at the child, then at the woman before him, a woman who had once been involved in the sale of lives, but who had not let go when she should have run. Finally, he just said, "Let's start over. No lawyers, no church witnesses, no relatives. Just a wooden roof, a few guns on the wall, and two broken adults who stood up for a child who didn't know who to call mom and dad." The days that followed were slow and painful. Elena cleaned out the cabin, tore away the bloody curtains, burned the smuggler's belongings. She learned to make formula-changed diapers and soothe the baby when he woke up in the middle of the night. Silas fixed the roof, blocked the drafts from the doors, and built a small wooden hammock by the fireplace. The hand that had once gripped a gun learned to support a tiny head or wipe away a snotty nose with a warm cloth. For the first time in years, the cabin was filled with human voices, not the sighs of solitude, but soft chuckles, hesitant lullabies, the wooden clicks of hands touching the future. No one ever mentioned Crenshaw or the traffickers again. They buried their bodies deep in the woods with no headstones or flowers. Their deaths were the end, and the boy Thomas was the only beginning that mattered. Silas had thought he would die, quietly buried beside his wife, leaving nothing but dirt and a few animal skins behind. But now, as he watched Thomas play on the floor, tottering on his weak legs, he realized something he was living for the first time in 30 years. Neither of them mentioned the words father or mother at first. Elena didn't dare, Silas wasn't used to it. But then one morning as Thomas fell face down on the floor, mouth pouting, arms outstretched, he uttered a simple sound, "Pa." Both Silas and Elena froze. The boy repeated more clearly this time, Silas turned away, pretending not to hear, but his hand tightened around the tin cup. Something inside his chest softened, not pain, but warmth, not loss, but renewal. From then on, they were no longer two adults and a child. They were a family. No papers, no blood, no ties from the outside world. Just faith. Faith that sometimes the most broken things can be put together into the most beautiful things. And in that little wooden cabin, every evening when the fire in the stove was blazing, there was a child sitting on Pa's lap, waving his arms and smiling. There was a woman who had once lost her way, now sitting quietly sewing by the light of an oil lamp. There was a man who had once denied everything, now closing his eyes to listen to every breath, every laugh, like a song he thought he would never hear. Thomas didn't need anyone to prove his bloodline. He just needed to know here, in the middle of the forest, in the middle of old wounds and long nights that had once been meaningless, he was chosen, kept, and loved.